Dawn rises over Istanbul, yet the city breathes not with hope, but with dread. The Bosphorus shimmers with the pale light of morning, yet its waves seem heavy, burdened with the fear that courses through every stone street, every silent courtyard. For centuries, the Janissaries, once the Sultan's shield, the empire's pride, have towered over this city, their presence a guarantee of both protection and terror. Now that same presence teeters on the brink of annihilation. Within the ornate chambers of Topkapi Palace, Sultan Mahmud II paces. His hands are clenched around the hilt of a decision centuries in the making. Before him lies a city held hostage by its own defenders, a brotherhood corrupted by decades of unchecked power. By nightfall, the order that once guarded sultans and conquered continents will face a reckoning so brutal that Istanbul itself will remember it forever. Yet even Mahmud cannot foresee the full cost of the peace he intends to impose. The Janissaries were once the sword and shield of the Ottoman state, men forged in discipline and loyalty, taken as boys from Christian families and transformed into soldiers bound to the Sultan's will. But power, left unchecked, breeds corruption. By the early 19th century, the Janissaries had abandoned their sacred duties. They extorted money from shopkeepers, terrorized citizens, and wielded their influence like a weapon over the streets. Every attempt at reform had been met with rebellion. Sultans were threatened, grand viziers assassinated, and Istanbul itself seemed to bend beneath the weight of their booted feet. Fear had a single name in this city. Children scattered at the sound of marching boots. Merchants shuttered their shops at dusk, and families whispered warnings when Janissaries passed. Once heroes, they had become nightmares, their reputation cemented in blood and oppression. Rumors swirled like smoke, whispers of mutiny, of resistance, of the Sultan plotting to end them once and for all. And as June 1826 approached, every corner of Istanbul trembled in anticipation of what history would soon witness. Inside the Janissary barracks, tension thickened the air like the scent of wet gunpowder. Men gathered in tight knots, clutching weapons with fingers white from fear and anger alike. Rumors of a new modern army, loyal only to Mahmud, had reached them, and the very thought of reform ignited their fury. The city outside held its breath, as if even the minarets paused in the silence, waiting for the storm to break. Then at midday, the storm came. The Janissaries overturned their cauldrons, a signal that had echoed through centuries, a call to arms that none could ignore. Hundreds poured into the streets, shouts tearing through the city like cannon fire. Shops shuttered, families cowered, and panic spread like wildfire. The Janissaries were rising once more, but within Topkapi, Mahmud's decision was resolute. Mercy would be set aside. The Prophet's sacred banner unfurled before a gathering crowd, summoning every loyal soldier and trembling citizen to witness the Sultan's intent. The message was clear. The empire would be saved, whatever the cost. Troops and townsfolk assembled in Sultanahmet Square, their hearts pounding against the uncertainty of the day. The Janissaries, barricaded in their stronghold, rejected the ultimatum. Their eyes flashed beneath battered helmets, defiance etched into every line of their faces. They were the last of a proud order, men who had survived decades of power struggles, palace intrigue, and rebellion. Yet now, centuries of privilege collided with the harsh realities of a sultan unwilling to bend. The die had been cast. Cannon fire shattered the uneasy afternoon. Flames and shrapnel tore through the Janissary barracks, smoke coiling into the sky as screams of men and the groans of collapsing timber filled the streets. Panic rippled through the defenders, Some cast down their swords and fled, only to be cut down in the chaos. Others charged blindly, hoping to turn the tide, and met a swift death. The ground became slick with blood, the air thick with acrid smoke, and the once mighty halls of the Janissaries transformed into a charnel house. Within hours, resistance crumbled. Flames devoured wooden halls, and the few still fighting were met with no mercy. Even boys trained as soldiers, pleading for life, fell under the inexorable fury of the Sultan's wrath. By evening, the Etmeydanu, the heart of Janissary power, was a smoking ruin. Across Istanbul, hidden Janissaries were hunted down. Alleys, taverns, and even disguised homes became hunting grounds. The Bektashi order, spiritual allies of the Janissaries, were outlawed, their lodges shuttered, their influence extinguished. By nightfall, a profound silence descended upon the city, a silence marking the end of an era. And as the city slept, unknowing yet forever changed, Sultan Mahmud II began shaping a new dawn. From the ashes of terror, a disciplined army would rise, and Istanbul, for the first time in generations, would breathe free from the shadow of its former protectors. But the memory of bloodshed, of families lost, of streets soaked with the legacy of fear, would linger, proof that history's turning points are always written in fire and shadow. The Janissaries were gone, and with their fall, Istanbul teetered on the edge of a new age, one that promised both hope and an uneasy reckoning with the ghosts of a violent past. The smoke had barely cleared from the Etmeydanu when Istanbul awoke to a reality that seemed almost unreal. Streets still smoldered, the air thick with the stench of charred wood and blood. From the windows of shuttered homes, mothers peered through soot-streaked glass, clutching children too young to understand the significance of what had just occurred. Merchants stepped cautiously into alleyways, counting losses not just in goods but in lives, in history, in the invisible weight of centuries lifted by a single, merciless day. Inside the ruins of the barracks, the echoes of the fallen lingered. Among the corpses, some still warm, lay men who had been soldiers, fathers, and brothers. Eyewitnesses later would speak of their terror, their confusion, and in the smallest moments, clutching a sibling, raising a hand in vain to beg for mercy. They became more than warriors. They became symbols of a vanished world. Ahmet, a young Janissary of barely 20 winters, had joined the corps as a boy, swept from a village along the Danube. He had believed in the honor of the uniform, in the discipline instilled in him by masters who promised loyalty and strength. Yet as the cannons tore through the barracks, he discovered a harsher truth. Loyalty could not withstand the weight of reform. In a blind panic, he ran through the smoke, his eyes watering from ashes, hoping to escape. But the city itself had turned against him. Even allies were gone, leaving only the cold inevitability of death and ruin. On the streets, ordinary citizens emerged from hiding, their relief tempered by horror. Mehmet, a shopkeeper in the shadow of the Blue Mosque, had spent decades paying protection money to survive. As he stepped out into the daylight, he counted the bodies littering the square, the remnants of barricades that had once seemed invincible. He could scarcely believe that the men who had tormented his family for years were gone. And yet the emptiness they left behind was uncanny, almost unnatural. The city felt abandoned, as though the presence of terror had defined its very heartbeat. But not all survived by fleeing or hiding. Some faced their former oppressors head-on. Fatma, a widow who had lost her husband to the Janissaries' cruelty years before, watched as the soldiers charged the cannons in desperate fury. Her heart pounded, as she saw boys no older than her own brother fall beneath the gunner's fire. She knew she should look away, should turn from the carnage, but she could not. In the final cries of the dying, she heard the justice long denied, raw and indiscriminate. The Bektashi lodges, once centers of spiritual guidance for the Janissaries, became hunting grounds. Men and women who had once sung in honor of the order were dragged into streets, their heads bowed, their faith now criminal. The Sultan's decree was unyielding. No trace of the Janissary influence could remain. Istanbul's spiritual landscape shifted overnight, a landscape marked not by devotion, but by fear and obedience. Families of fallen Janissaries faced ruin. Women wept openly in courtyards, clutching the names of sons and husbands who would never return. Children, some still in training, wandered aimlessly, unsure if they were orphans, unsure if the world they knew had ended. And yet amidst the grief, there was a faint glimmer. The oppressive yoke of centuries had been lifted, and for the first time, the city's people could glimpse a future not dictated by terror. Within Topkapi, Mahmud II received reports of the aftermath. Casualty numbers, estimates of surviving insurgents, and lists of Bektashi lodges to be closed filled the scrolls delivered to his chambers. Each report was a reminder of the price he had demanded. He had acted decisively, but the weight of authority, of choosing which lives to spare and which to sacrifice, pressed upon him like a physical burden. For all his victory, he was not untouched by the human cost of the Auspicious incident. Yet Istanbul's streets demanded order. The new army, disciplined and loyal, marched through neighborhoods once dominated by fear. Their boots struck the cobblestones in measured rhythm, a sound at once comforting and unsettling. Citizens peeked from behind doors and windows, unsure whether to celebrate or tremble. This army was not the Janissaries. They were strangers in steel, a promise of protection tempered by the memory of yesterday's slaughter. Even as the city adjusted, whispers persisted. Survivors of the Janissary order, those who had fled, hidden, or disguised themselves, moved cautiously through Istanbul. Rumors of resistance, of retribution, of vengeance flickered like dying embers in the back streets. Some sought a reconciliation, others plotted survival. The Sultan's men, however, were vigilant. The message was unmistakable. The empire tolerated no remnants of the old guard. The balance of power had shifted, and the shadow of the Janissaries, once inescapable, was gone, but not forgotten. By nightfall, Istanbul had settled into a fragile rhythm. Lamps flickered across the Bosphorus, casting wavering light on water that had borne witness to centuries of triumph and terror. The city slept uneasily, haunted by both the horrors of the past and the uncertainty of the future. It had survived the fall of the Janissaries, yet the cost was etched into its stones, its alleys, and its people. And in the quiet, one truth remained. History had turned its page violently, mercilessly, but irrevocably. The Janissaries, once untouchable, had fallen. Yet the echoes of their power, the fear they inspired, the lives they destroyed, would linger for generations, a reminder that empires are forged not only in victories, but in the shadows of those who resisted them. The day after the Etmeydanı burned, Istanbul was a city reborn, or at least forced to pretend it was. Smoke lingered in alleys, the scent of charred timber and human blood still heavy in the air. The streets bore the traces of terror, overturned carts, shattered doors, and the silent testimony of those who had vanished forever. Yet amidst this ruin, the machinery of empire began its careful rotation. For Sultan Mahmud II knew that survival depended not on vengeance alone, but on swift, decisive reform. From the palace, Mahmud issued orders that would reshape the Ottoman state. The Janissaries had been the empire's most formidable military force, but centuries of corruption had rendered them a liability. They were gone now, reduced to memory, yet the vacuum they left could not remain. Within weeks, a new, disciplined army, the Asakir-i Mansur-i Muhammadiyya, or Victorious Soldiers of Muhammad, rose from the ashes. Unlike the Janissaries, these soldiers would answer only to the Sultan. Uniformed, trained, and loyal, they represented the centralization of power that Mahmud had long envisioned. The streets themselves bore witness to this transformation. Citizens, who had spent decades living under the shadow of the Janissaries, cautiously emerged. Shopkeepers reopened their stalls, children played where once they had hidden, and the nightly dread that had defined Istanbul for generations slowly ebbed. Yet the relief was tentative. Even with the Janissaries gone, the memory of oppression lingered, a ghost threading through families, markets, and mosques. Istanbul had been liberated, but it had been scarred irrevocably. Politically, Mahmud's victory allowed him to consolidate authority like never before. Rebellious governors, corrupt officials, and entrenched factions who had relied on the Janissaries' power were forced to reckon with the new reality. Loyalty now meant obedience to the Sultan, not to a centuries-old brotherhood that had once been untouchable. Mahmud moved swiftly, replacing entrenched officers with men whose allegiance could be verified, and enacting regulations that modernized the administration. Istanbul and the empire at large became a testing ground for centralized power enforced with discipline rather than fear. The Bektashi order, spiritual and ideological allies of the Janissaries, was outlawed. Lodges were closed, texts burned, and leaders imprisoned or executed. Their influence, once subtle and pervasive, was erased from public life. The order had long provided a spiritual framework that justified Janissary authority, but without the soldiers themselves, it became a liability. In silencing them, Mahmud was not merely punishing collaborators. He was extinguishing a cultural pillar that had sustained centuries of militarized privilege. The city's moral and religious landscape shifted overnight, leaving citizens to navigate an unfamiliar terrain of loyalty, obedience, and cautious hope. Yet the transformation was not purely administrative or military. Istanbul itself became a laboratory for social change. Streets were patrolled by soldiers loyal to the Sultan, not to any local faction. Taxes were enforced with consistency rather than intimidation. Merchants who had once paid tribute to the Janissaries now dealt with a government asserting its authority through law rather than terror. The psychological shift was profound. Fear, the defining rhythm of everyday life, began to give way to uncertainty, tempered by the promise of order. Still, there were those who remembered and who mourned. Families of the slain Janissaries moved silently through the city, their grief mingling with resentment. Some plotted quietly in the back streets, seeking vengeance that would never find a proper outlet. And in quiet corners, whispers lingered. The empire's power had grown centralized, yes, but at the cost of lives, faiths, and traditions once woven into the city's identity. The Auspicious incident was both triumph and trauma, a decisive turning point whose moral weight could not be measured in victories alone. Outside the palace, the new army drilled relentlessly. The streets of Istanbul, once haunted by rogue soldiers, now echoed with the disciplined cadence of marching boots. Citizens watched from behind windows and doorways, a mixture of relief and wariness in their eyes. The city had survived, But survival demanded vigilance. The lessons of the Janissaries' centuries-long dominance could not be ignored. Every parade, every drill, every strict enforcement of order was a reminder that power had shifted and that the cost of defiance was absolute. Sultan Mahmud II, meanwhile, understood the precariousness of his triumph. He had erased a threat that had long loomed over the throne, but in doing so, he had become a figure both feared and revered. In letters to provincial governors, he emphasized loyalty above all, the eradication of factionalism, and the modernization of both military and civil administration. Mahmud's vision was clear: a centralized empire where authority flowed from the Sultan, not from privileged guilds of soldiers or entrenched religious orders. The Janissaries were gone, but the shadow they left shaped the empire's trajectory for decades to come. By winter, Istanbul had regained a semblance of normalcy. Markets bustled, mosques filled with worshippers, and the Bosphorus reflected a city determined to live again. Yet the lessons of June 1826 would not be forgotten. Streets still bore the scars of cannon fire. Families still grieved sons and husbands lost to history's swift judgment. And the empire itself had been reminded that authority, once challenged, could be enforced with devastating clarity. The Janissaries had vanished, but in their absence a new world had emerged, one of centralized power, disciplined soldiers, and citizens navigating the delicate line between freedom and obedience. Istanbul's heartbeat, once defined by terror, now pulsed with a cautious rhythm, hope tempered by the memory of what had been lost. History had turned, merciless and unflinching, leaving both scars and a roadmap for the empire's future. And yet beneath the surface of victory, whispers persisted. Would the empire remain stable under this new order, or were the seeds of future unrest already planted in the ashes of the past? The echo of cannon fire had long faded from Istanbul, but the empire itself bore the weight of what had transpired. The Janissaries, once the backbone of Ottoman military might, had been eradicated in a single, decisive stroke, leaving a vacuum that reshaped the political, social, and cultural landscape of the empire. Sultan Mahmud II's triumph was immediate and absolute, yet its consequences would reverberate for decades, marking both the promise of reform and the peril of centralized authority. The first and most obvious transformation was military. The Asakiri Mansur-i Muhammadiyah, the new army, was trained in the European style, disciplined, uniformed, and loyal to the Sultan above all else. European advisors were invited to Istanbul, and Ottoman officers studied in military academies that emphasized strategy, drill, and hierarchy. For the first time in centuries, the empire possessed a standing force that could be relied upon to enforce law and defend territory without the unpredictable interference of rogue Janissaries. The shadow of the old corps had been extinguished, but their absence also carried a warning: power unchecked invites chaos, and the Sultan's hand would be swift and unforgiving in future threats. Yet the eradication of the Janissaries was not merely military, it was profoundly political. Mahmud II's consolidation of power allowed him to bypass the entrenched factions that had long limited sultanic authority. Governors and bureaucrats who had once relied on Janissary support to maintain influence were forced to adjust, either aligning themselves with the Sultan or facing removal. The centralization of authority created an empire that appeared stronger on paper, but also more dependent on the absolute control of the throne. The delicate balance between local autonomy and imperial oversight had shifted decisively toward the center, sowing seeds of tension that would reappear in later decades. Socially, Istanbul and other Ottoman cities underwent a subtle yet profound transformation. The terror of midnight raids, the extortion of merchants, and the constant threat of Janissary violence had defined daily life for centuries. With the Janissaries gone, citizens experienced a freedom that was almost dizzying in its novelty. Markets flourished, neighborhoods reopened, and families dared to reclaim public spaces that had long been off-limits. Yet this newfound liberty was tempered by awareness. The Sultan had demonstrated that obedience and loyalty were paramount, and deviation, even in thought or subtle action, could be met with uncompromising force. Freedom, it seemed, came with the price of vigilance. Culturally, the purge reshaped Istanbul's spiritual landscape. The Bektashi order, outlawed for its association with the Janissaries, left behind shuttered lodges and silent halls. Their rituals, once a cornerstone of Janissary identity, disappeared almost overnight, leaving citizens to navigate religious life without the guidance or protection of the order. In some neighborhoods, older residents whispered in secret about the vanished practices, while younger generations grew up unaware of a spiritual network that had once been woven into the very fabric of the city. The removal of the Bektashis was both a moral and strategic act. It eliminated potential sources of rebellion, but also erased centuries of tradition in a single, decisive stroke. The psychological consequences of the Auspicious incident were equally profound. Istanbul's citizens, long accustomed to the arbitrary terror of the Janissaries, experienced a rare sense of security. Yet the memory of what had transpired lingered like a shadow, informing behavior and shaping perception. Families avoided streets where violence had erupted. Elders recounted stories of cannon fire and flame as warnings, and a cautious respect for authority became a central tenet of everyday life. The Janissaries' violent end was a lesson. History's turning points are often written in blood, and the new order was as much a product of fear as of reform. Beyond Istanbul, the eradication of the Janissaries influenced the trajectory of the Ottoman Empire. Provincial leaders observed the Sultan's decisiveness and recognized that rebellion carried consequences of unparalleled severity. This fostered a climate of compliance, enabling Mahmud and his successors to pursue reforms in taxation, administration, and infrastructure with fewer obstacles. European powers, watching from afar, noted both the efficacy and brutality of the purge, recognizing that the Ottoman state could now act with a unified, centralized authority that was previously unimaginable. Yet even as the empire moved forward, the Janissaries' shadow persisted. Military tradition, once defined by their strict hierarchy and esprit de corps, required rebuilding. The cultural memory of their power and excess informed the training of new soldiers, who were taught to respect authority, but never to emulate the unrestrained corruption of their predecessors. Scholars, poets, and historians reflected on the events of June 1826, writing both cautionary tales and lessons on the fragility of power. In literature and oral memory alike, the Janissaries became both villains and symbols, a reminder that privilege, when unchecked, can corrode institutions from within. By the late 1820s, Istanbul had largely recovered its rhythm. Markets hummed with commerce. The Bosphorus reflected a city confident in its survival, and the new army marched in precise formations through streets once dominated by fear. The Janissaries had vanished, their names forbidden in polite conversation, their lodges shuttered, their presence reduced to memory. And yet, the empire itself remained fragile. balanced precariously between reform and the resistance of tradition, between central authority and the echoes of rebellion that still whispered in provincial towns. The Auspicious incident, as it would be called, was more than a military purge. It was a catalyst for change. It demonstrated the Sultan's willingness to wield absolute power, reshaped the military and bureaucratic structures of the empire, and forced citizens to navigate a new social order born of violence and fear. The Janissaries were gone, but the lessons they left behind about loyalty, authority, and the cost of privilege would shape the Ottoman Empire for generations. And somewhere in the quiet corners of Istanbul, survivors of the old order watched the new world unfold, silent witnesses to an empire forged in fire, smoke, and irrevocable transformation. Even as Istanbul slowly regained a semblance of order, the ghosts of June 1826 lingered. The streets, newly alive with commerce and chatter, carried echoes of screams and the acrid stench of smoke. Families who had lost fathers, sons, or husbands navigated a city transformed not only by law and order, but by grief that refused to dissipate. The end of the Janissaries had brought safety. Yes, but safety carved from fire and blood leaves scars that no decree can erase. Among the ruins of their former world, survivors struggled to reclaim identity and dignity. Mustafa, a former Janissary who had hidden in the shadows of Istanbul during the purge, wandered from neighborhood to neighborhood, careful to avoid recognition. Once, he had been a soldier, proud and feared, bound by brotherhood to an institution older than the Sultan himself. Now, he was nameless, unmoored, haunted by the knowledge that his comrades, the very men who had shared his life, his meals, his training, were gone, reduced to ashes in Et Meidanu or dragged into alleys to meet their end. For women, the aftermath was no less brutal. Fatma, who had watched young Janissaries fall in desperation and rage, found herself both survivor and witness. Her neighbors whispered about the dead men, their eyes wide with disbelief and guilt, unsure how to acknowledge a terror that had disappeared overnight. Families once protected or oppressed by the Janissaries now faced a vacuum, and with it came both relief and trepidation. Without the familiar rhythm of fear, the city felt unsteady, as if the very ground had shifted beneath their feet. Children, the most innocent victims of a system built on coercion, were left bewildered. Boys who had been trained in the barracks, some as young as 12, wandered the streets in confusion, unsure whether they were soldiers, orphans, or simply children again. Girls, whose fathers had been soldiers, mothers, or merchants, found themselves thrust into adult responsibilities before their time, tasked with keeping households intact in the absence of male guardians. The city's population, once dominated by terror, now learned a painful lesson in resilience. Survival required adaptation, and grief demanded endurance. Even Sultan Mahmud II, for all his decisiveness, was not immune to the weight of what had occurred. In the quiet of Topkapı Palace, he pondered the lives extinguished by cannon fire and steel, the families shattered, the spiritual institutions dismantled. He had acted decisively, securing the future of the empire and centralizing power. Yet he could not ignore the human cost of his reforms. Advisors spoke of the Auspicious incident with triumph, framing it as the necessary act of a ruler safeguarding the state. Mahmud, however, understood that victory and morality were rarely synonymous. History had judged him as ruthless, and he knew the memory of bloodshed would follow him as long as he lived. Stories of heroism and despair circulated in hushed tones among survivors. Mehmet, a shopkeeper who had hidden behind a counter while cannon fire ripped through the barracks, began quietly assisting families of the fallen, offering food, shelter, and reassurance. He understood that survival was only part of the equation. The city needed compassion to rebuild, to heal, to reclaim the humanity that violence had stolen. In alleys once haunted by fear, neighbors now shared whispered stories of survival, forging connections born of loss, yet tempered by hope. Not all attempts at rebuilding were peaceful. Some survivors of the Janissaries, scattered and leaderless, plotted quietly in hidden corners, imagining revenge that would never materialize. They observed the new army with wary eyes, remembering the brotherhood that had once granted them power and purpose. Yet the Sultan's reforms had dismantled not only the core, but its ideology. There was no returning to the old world, even if survivors desired it. The foundations had been destroyed. What remained was memory, painful, vivid, and indelible. The moral reckoning extended beyond the city. Provincial governors, once reliant on Janissary influence, now reported directly to Mahmud, aware that defiance carried consequences harsher than ever before. In the empire's rural regions, whispers of the purge traveled slowly, carried by travelers, merchants, and soldiers. Families debated the ethics of obedience versus rebellion, of survival versus principle. The Janissaries' violent removal became a lens through which Ottoman society understood both the power and peril of centralized authority. Yet amidst grief and fear, glimmers of resilience appeared. Istanbul's markets regained vibrancy, schools reopened, and religious practice, though altered by the suppression of the Bektashi order, continued with cautious devotion. Citizens adapted to a world where the omnipresent shadow of the Janissaries was gone, replaced by the disciplined, watchful presence of the Sultan's new army. Life returned, imperfect and tentative, but alive nonetheless. By the first anniversary of the Auspicious incident, Istanbul had changed irreversibly. Streets once dominated by fear now echoed with a cautious optimism, tempered by memory. Families mourned openly, yet they also celebrated survival. Former Janissaries, wherever they had survived, learned to navigate a world that had turned against them, reconciling pride and shame with the necessity of hiding. And Sultan Mahmud II, whose vision had shaped this new order, bore the quiet weight of his choices, aware that history would remember both his triumph and the human toll exacted to achieve it. The city's pulse had shifted, but its memory had not. Shadows lingered where the dead had fallen, and in every alley, every burned courtyard, Istanbul remembered the brotherhood that had once ruled through terror. The Janissaries were gone, but their legacy of fear, of authority, of rebellion and oppression remained etched into the soul of the empire, a reminder that the cost of reform is measured not only in victories, but in the human lives irrevocably changed along the way. The smoke of Et Meidana had long cleared, but the flames of change continued to blaze across the Ottoman Empire. The eradication of the Janissaries in June 1826 did more than reshape Istanbul. It set the stage for a profound transformation of the empire's political, military, and social structures. Sultan Mahmud II, aware that the old order had hindered progress for decades, moved quickly to ensure that the empire would not merely survive, but modernize, even at the cost of tradition. Central to Mahmud's vision was the creation of a new military system. The Asakiri Mansour-e Muhammadiyye, forged in the aftermath of the purge, became the foundation of an army trained along European lines. Officers studied strategy and logistics, soldiers drilled with discipline unknown to the Janissaries, and firearms were standardized. European advisors taught artillery, infantry maneuvers, and fortification methods. For the first time, the Ottoman military could compete with European powers not only in numbers but in coordination, skill, and loyalty to the Sultan. The old, unpredictable chaos of Janissary rebellion would no longer dictate the empire's defense. Administrative reform followed swiftly. The Janissaries had long served as a bulwark for entrenched corruption, their influence extending into taxation, trade, and local governance. With them removed, Mahmud centralized power in the palace, replacing provincial governors and local officials with men whose allegiance could be verified. Tax collection became more systematic, and bureaucratic procedures, once hampered by Janissary interference, were enforced with precision. Efficiency replaced fear, though the memory of violence ensured that compliance was never voluntary. Citizens learned quickly that loyalty was rewarded, while defiance carried severe consequences. Yet the reform extended beyond administration and the military. The cultural and social landscape of the empire was irreversibly altered. The Bektashi order, outlawed for its association with the Janissaries, left spiritual gaps that the Sultan sought to fill with institutions loyal to the state. Religious and educational centers were reoriented to promote obedience and civic responsibility rather than factional loyalty. Students in new schools were taught history, mathematics, and military science, fostering a generation that understood both the empire's traditions and the imperatives of modernization. Istanbul, once dominated by fear, became a laboratory for a new Ottoman identity, disciplined, centralized, and forward-looking. Economic reform was equally critical. The Janissaries had long extorted wealth from merchants and disrupted trade. With their removal, commerce revived. Markets in Istanbul and other cities flourished as merchants regained confidence. Roads and ports, once under threat from rogue soldiers, were secured by the new army. Tax incentives encouraged production, and European traders, previously wary of instability, returned to Ottoman harbors. The empire, long stagnating under the weight of internal strife, now had the potential for economic resurgence, driven by both stability and innovation. However, the shadow of the Janissaries remained. Their violent end left a moral imprint that shaped policy and behavior for decades. Provincial governors, aware of Mahmud's decisiveness, acted with caution, ensuring that rebellion was unthinkable. Families remembered the swift justice meted out on June 1826, and loyalty, whether to the Sultan, the state, or local authorities, became a central tenet of survival. Yet whispers of resentment and nostalgia persisted. Former Janissaries, now scattered or hiding in remote regions, carried memories of their brotherhood and its privileges, reminding the empire that even eradicated forces could leave enduring legacies. The purge also influenced diplomacy. European powers watched closely as Mahmud centralized authority and modernized his forces. They recognized that the empire, though battered by internal strife, could act decisively and impose order with efficiency. This altered both trade negotiations and military alliances, as foreign governments recalibrated their expectations for Ottoman reliability and stability. The Janissaries' removal signaled that the empire was no longer ruled by unpredictable militias, but by a centralized authority capable of pursuing long-term reforms. Yet reforms were never painless. The centralization of authority, while necessary, created new vulnerabilities. Without the Janissaries as a buffer, the Sultan's power became absolute, placing immense pressure on a single ruler to maintain control. Regional unrest, though muted, still simmered. Displaced Janissaries and disaffected nobles could, under the right conditions, challenge authority again. Mahmud's reforms were as much a test of governance as they were of military innovation. Stability depended on vigilance, loyalty, and the careful calibration of fear and incentive. By the late 1820s, the Ottoman Empire had transformed. Istanbul's streets, once haunted by the roar of rebellion, now echoed with disciplined marching boots. Markets thrived, schools filled with students, and provincial governors reported directly to the palace. The Janissaries, and the culture of impunity they represented, had vanished. In their place stood a modernizing state, centralized, disciplined, and aware that progress demanded both ruthless decisiveness and careful management. Yet the lessons of the Auspicious incident endured. Reform often comes at a human cost. Authority is only as strong as its enforcement, and history's turning points are written not in negotiation, but in fire and blood. The empire had survived, but it had been irrevocably altered. Istanbul and the Ottoman state itself now moved forward in the shadow of a brotherhood that had once ruled through terror, a reminder that the path to modernization is never free from sacrifice. Decades after the Auspicious incident, the city of Istanbul still carried the shadow of the Janissaries. Though the streets were alive with commerce, education, and military discipline, the memory of the fallen soldiers remained etched in the collective consciousness. The Janissaries had been more than warriors. They had been a force that shaped daily life, governance, and culture for centuries. Their sudden eradication left a gap not only in the military, but in the soul of the empire, a void filled with fear, awe, and uneasy admiration. Historians, poets, and chroniclers grappled with how to record the events of June 1826. Some framed the purge as a necessary act of progress, celebrating Sultan Mahmud II's decisiveness and vision. Official accounts emphasized the chaos and corruption of the Janissaries, portraying their removal as both just and inevitable. Yet in private correspondence and oral memory, the tone was more complex. Survivors and witnesses recalled bravery and loyalty alongside violence and oppression. Boys who had trained in the barracks remembered camaraderie and discipline, while civilians remembered terror and extortion. The Janissaries became paradoxical symbols, heroes and villains intertwined, their legacy impossible to reduce to a single narrative. In literature and poetry, the Janissaries lived on as figures of caution and fascination. Writers depicted the halls of Et Meydan as haunted spaces where the past and present collided. Tales of cannon fire, flame, and desperate resistance were retold in schools and salons, a mixture of horror and awe, underscoring the consequences of unchecked power. Their uniforms, once symbols of authority, became objects of nostalgia and fear, reminding citizens that privilege enforced through violence could always be lost in an instant. The empire itself absorbed the lessons of their removal into policy and governance. Military academies emphasized discipline and loyalty to the state above all else, deliberately distancing themselves from the factionalism and autonomy that had allowed the Janissaries to dominate. Civil administrators learned that local compliance depended on accountability, and that fear, while effective in the short term, could never replace institutional integrity. The purge became a blueprint for balancing reform with control, a lesson repeated in later attempts to modernize the Ottoman state, from legal codification to infrastructure projects, and even in the Tanzimat reforms of the mid-19th century. Yet the human consequences lingered. Former Janissaries who had survived the purge carried scars, both physical and psychological. Many fled to remote provinces or across the empire's borders, living in obscurity and fear of discovery. Families of the dead struggled to reclaim honor and livelihoods, navigating a city that had changed overnight. Women who had witnessed the collapse of the order wrestled with grief and a newfound independence, assuming roles that had been denied to them under Janissary dominance. Children, orphaned or displaced, grew up under the dual weight of loss and survival, their identities shaped by the rupture in Istanbul's social fabric. Cultural memory was equally enduring. Neighborhoods where battles had raged retained the names of streets, alleys, and squares that recalled the violence. Stories of heroic resistance or tragic deaths were whispered through generations. Even as reform reshaped the empire, these memories anchored citizens to a past that was simultaneously feared and revered. In this way, the Janissaries' influence outlasted their bodies. Their presence survived in cautionary tales, moral lessons, and the rituals of remembrance. The moral and psychological imprint of the purge extended to the Sultan himself. Mahmud II, though celebrated for his reforms, was forever haunted by the consequences of his decisiveness. Advisors praised his vision and efficiency, but he alone bore the weight of lives extinguished and communities uprooted. In private reflection, he understood that the eradication of centuries-old privilege, however necessary, demanded a price that could never be quantified. History would remember him as a reformer, yet the human cost, the cries, the terror, the irrevocable rupture of lives, remained a quiet, unyielding presence in his conscience. Even in the empire's later decades, the shadow of the Janissaries influenced policy. Reformers invoked the purge as evidence that centralized authority could enforce modernization, while cautioning that such power required careful exercise. Military and civil leaders studied the events of June 1826, debating what constituted loyalty, obedience, and the balance between fear and governance. The Janissaries' story became a moral compass, a warning that power, if unchecked, could corrupt absolutely, and that reform, if decisive enough, could reshape the fate of an empire. By the mid-19th century, Istanbul had fully recovered in appearance, but not in memory. Streets were rebuilt, markets flourished, and a disciplined army patrolled the city, but citizens still spoke in hushed tones of the Auspicious incident. They remembered both the terror they had endured and the hope they had gained, aware that the city had survived only because brutality had cleared a path for reform. The Janissaries were gone, yet their shadow endured, a testament to the complex interplay of power, loyalty, and human cost. In the final reckoning, the legacy of the Janissaries was neither simple nor singular. They were oppressors and protectors, tyrants and symbols of tradition, memories of fear and reminders of courage. Their fall reshaped an empire, redefined authority, and created the conditions for modernization, but it did so at a price that could never be measured. Istanbul and the Ottoman Empire as a whole carried the echoes of their existence in every street, every institution, and every moral lesson drawn from fire and blood. The Janissaries had vanished from history as a living force, but their presence endured in memory, an eternal warning that the greatest turning points of empires are written in sacrifice, terror, and the shadows of the fallen. By the 1830s, Istanbul had grown quiet in a way it had not known for centuries. The streets no longer echoed with the stomping boots of rogue soldiers, and markets thrived without the threat of extortion. The Janissaries, once untouchable, were gone, obliterated in a single day of cannon fire and bloodshed that reshaped the city and the empire alike. Yet their absence, while decisive, carried profound implications that stretched far beyond the stones of Etmedana. The Ottoman Empire, long restrained by internal divisions and the insubordination of its elite troops, began to move with newfound purpose. Sultan Mahmud II had secured the throne from rebellion, but his victory was more than military. It was symbolic. The eradication of the Janissaries demonstrated that entrenched power could be challenged and dismantled, that the Sultan could enforce reforms with unflinching determination. Across the empire, provincial governors, merchants, and ordinary citizens adjusted to a new reality. Authority had been centralized, discipline enforced, and tradition bent to the will of the state. The new army, disciplined and loyal, became the backbone of modernization. Soldiers drilled in European tactics, studied strategy, and learned to obey without question. The threat of insubordination, once a constant shadow over the palace and provinces, was replaced by order, structure, and predictability. This disciplined force allowed Mahmud to implement administrative, fiscal, and educational reforms that had long been impossible under the Janissaries' watchful and often violent eyes. The empire could now operate on efficiency rather than intimidation, and the city of Istanbul could function without the constant hum of terror threading through daily life. Yet the human cost of the Auspicious incident remained palpable. Survivors of the Janissaries, boys, young men, and the rare older soldier who had escaped, lived scattered across the empire, haunted by loss and guilt. Families of the dead struggled to reclaim their lives amid a city rebuilt from ashes. Women assumed new responsibilities, children grew up orphaned or dislocated, and ordinary citizens bore the quiet weight of memories that could not be erased. Istanbul, in its revival, was forever marked by the trauma of that single, decisive day. Culturally, the empire also had to contend with the disappearance of institutions tied to the Janissaries. The Bektashi order, outlawed and erased from public life, had once provided spiritual cohesion for soldiers and civilians alike. With their lodges shuttered and rituals banned, a void opened in the social and religious fabric of the city. Mahmud sought to fill this void with institutions loyal to the state, fostering a citizenry educated in obedience, discipline, and civic duty. In this sense, reform was not only political or military, it was spiritual and cultural, reshaping how Ottomans understood loyalty, tradition, and the relationship between ruler and ruled. The memory of the Janissaries endured, however, and shaped the empire's collective consciousness. Chroniclers, poets, and historians wrestled with their dual legacy: heroes and oppressors, loyal defenders and corrupt tyrants. Oral histories recounted tales of bravery and horror, cautioning future generations about the corrupting influence of unchecked privilege and the dangers of centralized power wielded without accountability. The Janissaries' story became a moral compass, a reminder that the human cost of reform is often invisible in the records of victory, yet indelible in lived experience. On the streets of Istanbul, ordinary citizens adapted. Markets flourished, neighborhoods revived, and the Bosphorus reflected a city confident in its survival. Children who had once hidden at the sound of marching boots now played in courtyards once dominated by fear, yet shadows persisted. Burned buildings, scarred stones, and whispered stories of men cut down by cannon fire reminded the city of the violent birth of its newfound freedom. Survival had been bought at a high price, and the lessons of June 1826 lingered in the collective memory. Sultan Mahmud II, for all his triumph, was never untroubled by the scale of his decisions. He had removed a centuries-old threat, centralized authority, and set the empire on a path of modernization. Yet he had done so with a heavy hand. History would remember him as a decisive reformer, but privately he bore the weight of the lives extinguished, the families shattered, and the moral ambiguities inherent in wielding absolute power. His reforms were a testament to vision and discipline, but they were also a reminder that the cost of change is never measured in convenience or expedience. It is measured in human lives. The legacy of the Janissaries extended into the empire's future. Their eradication demonstrated that entrenched systems of privilege could be dismantled, creating space for modernization, centralization, and disciplined governance. It allowed the empire to pursue reforms in administration, education, military organization, and fiscal policy that had long been impossible. Yet it also left a warning etched into the Ottoman consciousness. Power unchecked corrupts, rebellion can be met with devastating force, and progress often demands both courage and cruelty. By the mid-19th century, Istanbul was unrecognizable in many ways, yet the city still carried the memory of the Janissaries in every alley, every burned courtyard, every whispered story. Their shadow persisted in literature, history, and collective memory, a reminder that the greatest turning points of empires are often forged in fire, ashes, and blood. The Janissaries were gone, yet their presence endured, shaping the Ottoman Empire's identity, policies, and consciousness long after the smoke had cleared. In the end, the Auspicious incident was more than a military purge. It was a crucible that forged the modern Ottoman state. Istanbul had survived, the empire had been strengthened, and Sultan Mahmud II had secured his vision of a centralized, disciplined, and forward-looking realm. Yet the story of the Janissaries reminds us that every empire, every reform, and every moment of progress carries with it the shadow of human cost, the price of survival, order, and transformation, written in the blood of the fallen and remembered forever in the stones and hearts of those left behind.